It's been a very interesting 9 years since I was here before. I have to say that my wife Deborah and I totally love Australia. When we were here in 2001, we fell in love with your wonderful country. It's a thrill to be invited back, but it's also a tragedy that the need was felt to have to invite me back. Now, the good news is apparently Philip Nitsky has been driven out of the country in terms of his work in assisted suicide in this country. The bad news is he's moving to Washington. And so with Peter Singer and Philip Nitsky, thank you very much.
And Alan Trounson.
Yeah, Alan Trounson too, yes. Alan Trounson is the head of the Center for California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. He's making about $500,000 a year on our borrowed money. I'm from California. We are sinking beneath the red debt waves. I bring you greetings from Arnold. He had a picture in the paper a couple of months ago, and his shirt was off. And he looked just like any other man in his 60s. So I called my wife, Deborah, and I said, honey, you know I've wanted to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger all these years, and now I do. Anyway, I was struck when Dr. James was talking about, how these are difficult times, and what Liz had to say, these are difficult times. And they are difficult times. They are times in which people's lives are literally at stake, and you being here may, as a consequence, actually save a life someday, somebody you may never hear of. And a lot of people get depressed because you can't win them all, as the old saying goes, and it's true. Or to quote A Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. We can control pain, as Dr. James said, but people say that means I should have the right to die, and it's really incongruous. But if there are 100 people lying on the road and you can only save 80, you save 80. If you can only save 60, you save 60. If you can only save 40, you save 40. If you can only save one, you save one. That's our obligation as human beings. And the fact that you're here tonight, when you could be out on a lovely evening here in Brisbane, tells me that you understand that. And I appreciate that. And it's very, very important. Because there are people who may never meet you, who will be thankful, so thankful that you cared enough to be part of a movement that seeks only to save human life and maintain human dignity. And the question becomes, why now? Why now? As Dr. James stole my thunder, stole the open to my speech. I'm kidding. Why now? When we can indeed alleviate most pain, when we have the hospice movement that can have a multidisciplinary system of helping people who are dying with their physical pain, with their spiritual needs, with their social needs, a multidisciplinary service, people hands-on. Why now? And I've been fighting euthanasia and dealing with the culture of death since 1993. I won't go deeply into how I got into that, but most people who become activists have a story. Mine is that a good friend of mine killed herself under the influence of Hemlock Society literature, Hemlock Society being the premier assisted suicide advocacy group in the States. And I was so upset about it, I asked her executrix to send her suicide file, which I knew she'd have because she was so organized, and it was filled with literature, literally proselytizing for suicide. It was like religious proselytizing, stories of good suicides, the drugs to take and how to take them, how to use a plastic bag to kill yourself. And you remember 9 years ago, I brought one of those plastic bags, which at the time Philip Nitsky was importing into this country, and because of the work we were able to do, busting in the front page of the Australian, I think, Philip Nitsky went out of business in the plastic bag business. Well, the reason I got into exposing the plastic bag was because that's how my friend killed herself. And when I saw this, I was so upset that, long story short, I jumped into this issue. I was doing other things in public policy advocacy work. And that led from one thing to another, and found out that there is a tremendous connection between a wide variety of issues, some of which you might not think of. For example, radical environmentalism. Well, what does that have to do with assisted suicide? Assisted suicide says that human life does not have intrinsic value simply because it's human, that there is no such thing as a sanctity of human life ethic. And therefore, if somebody decides they don't want to live, not only should they be able to kill themselves, which is an individual act, but there should be able to be a conspiracy or a joint enterprise to make somebody dead. Now, what does that have to do with radical environmentalism? Now, I'm not talking about good environmental practices, of course. I'm talking about the radical environmentalism that says we should reduce the human population to under 1 billion. Think of the implications of that. I'm talking about the radical environmentalism that is telling your children that human beings not only do not have special moral worth, not only that human exceptionalism is a fiction, but that we are the villains of the planet. We are the aids of the planet Earth. We are a scourge. And if we come to accept that self-perception as a vermin species, which we are literally called sometimes, then that will change how we act not only towards ourselves, but towards each other and towards the environment. So there is a connection, even though it may not seem obvious, between a radical environmental idea and assisted suicide, and that is a disdain for the sanctity of human life. I'll get a little more into that tomorrow night at a dinner, and I won't belabor it at this point. But in issue after issue, there is this overarching theme of anti-human exceptionalism, which is to say anti-humanism. And if we accept anti-humanism, that changes how we treat the most weak and vulnerable among us. Because if they do not have value simply because they're human, if the 85-year-old woman with Alzheimer's disease does not have value, even though she can't relate back and she can't give back, then she's no longer safe. She's no longer us, she's them. If the disabled person like Terry Schiavo, and I worked very hard on that case, very closely with her family to try to save her life, can be dehydrated to death, her food and water taken away, that if you did it to a dog, you would go to jail, and it is called medical ethics, then there is something wrong with our concept of humanity. So what's going on here? The why now is still something I'm kind of trying to work with, but I read a book by a friend of mine actually, called Imagining the Future by Yuval Levin. Yuval Levin is a bioethicist back in the States, a conservative bioethicist. Have any of you heard of Leon Kass? A few of you, yeah. Leon Kass is really a really excellent thinker, one of the most profound people you can read. And he was the head of President Bush's President's Council on Bioethics. And Yuval is his protege, one of his proteges, and he wrote a book called Imagining the Future, which was not about particularly euthanasia or bioethics. It was mainly about stem cell research, in which Yuval tried to explain liberals to conservatives and explain conservatives to liberals. But he had in the opening part of his book something that really struck me in terms of the why now. And he wrote that Descartes described health as, quote, without doubt the primary good and the foundation of all the other goods of this life. Well, we can understand that. What is the old saying? If you have your health, you have everything. And there's certainly truth to that, because if you have your health, life is more enjoyable, you get out, you're more vigorous, you can do more things. But we have to be very careful there, because it can begin to imply that if you don't have your health, somehow your life is less worth living, which of course we must reject at every opportunity. And in fact, if somebody doesn't have their health or their ability, it is our obligation as humans to help them to carry some of the burdens that they have to carry. That's part of being in a community. It seems to me that's part of the human obligation. But back to Descartes, Yuval talks about how at one time a primary purpose, or perhaps even the primary purpose of society, was to help people lead virtuous lives. And I know when I was growing up, I'm 61, I know you can't tell that. But when I was growing up in the 50s and into the 60s, boy, we were pounded on leading a virtuous life. My mother and dad would say, you're going on a date, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. Yeah, okay, I won't. And you know what? We did. It took a lot of work. I mean, teenagers then were just like teenagers now. But in those days, we had a certain support system and, in fact, a coercive system that had us live one way. And today, I think, the system has changed to kind of encourage a different way. But that's just one small example of what I think Yuval was talking about. Helping people have principles so that when they came up against a difficult issue in life, okay, this principle, we now have something to apply. Practicing before the need, before the crisis, so that you can act in an ethical way when the crisis comes. Yuval then says this, and this really struck me as right. He said, quote, "But Descartes' formulation and the worldview of modern science sees health not only as a foundational but also a principal goal, not only as a beginning but also an end. Relief and preservation from disease and pain, from misery and necessity, become the defining ends of human action and therefore of human societies." Now that's a different thing altogether. If the purpose of society is to prevent suffering, that very quickly becomes preventing the sufferer. Because what is suffering? We look at, okay, there's the personal suffering, the person who has cancer, the person with a sudden disability. Then there's the suffering of that human being's family. And my uncle died of Alzheimer's disease. I know what that is. My uncle suffered. My aunt suffered watching my uncle suffered. My mother suffered watching her brother suffer. I suffered watching my mother suffer, watching my aunt suffer, watching my uncle suffer, right? Now, how quickly it could become, if the purpose of society is to make sure that my uncle doesn't suffer, my aunt doesn't suffer, my mother doesn't suffer, and I don't suffer, and society doesn't suffer because of the cost it took to care for him all of those years when he was sick, very quickly could come into being Bruno Micheletti shouldn't be here. Because the way you end suffering is to end the sufferer. And I think we're heading in that direction. Because it's almost, I said I was Steve Austin, I'm on the radio right now. 9 o'clock. At one point, and this is the first time I'd ever said that, he was asking me, we were getting into some of this, and I said, our aversion to suffering has become neurotic. And I think it has, because it is moving us from a natural human behavior towards each other into a distorted aversion, such strong aversion to suffering that we are willing to engage in practices that for millennia have been anathema. And if Yuval is right, if the purpose of society has shifted to making sure there's no suffering, which, by the way, is a fruitless exercise, talk about utopianism, it's never going to happen. And suffering, I'm not getting into redemptive suffering, but suffering, part of suffering gains wisdom. I know the things that I used to do that caused me and others pain, I don't do precisely because it caused me and others pain. That's how we grow. And yes, we have an absolute obligation to mitigate each other's suffering. But the idea of being able to avoid it altogether is neurotic and can lead us into very unethical practices and immoral practices. Now, this is nothing, does this become more dangerous in the immediate effect, I think, than in bioethics, biomedical ethics, our medical practices, how we treat patients in the healthcare system. And what I'm very concerned about, and I've been working on, I went from assisted suicide to the bioethics issue, to the human cloning issue, and now to radical animal rights, and then to radical environmentalism. My jurisdiction, my portfolios, they keep growing. In any event, I read this article by a fellow, he's a Brit, named Alistair Cochrane, in the journal Bioethics, December 2009. If you want to know what's going wrong in the world or what's about to go wrong in the world, read the professional journals. Am I right? Yeah, because a lot of this stuff doesn't come from the bottom up. The people are not marching through the streets demanding a right to die. There's a very small cadre of activists and people like Philip Nitsky who the media swoon for. But mainly it's coming from the academy, from the universities, and from the top down. And so I read this article, and I wanted to share it with you tonight, because this fellow who's a bioethicist, Alistair Cochrane, understands the stakes and sets them out very clearly and very candidly. Often, I think we've all been frustrated how the other side moves and shakes, and it's like Jell-O being pounded to the wall. You can't quite make, or Vegemite maybe? I don't know. No, I don't like it. But they usually try to avoid, for political reasons, because they're all politicians, the consequences and implications of their advocacy. But this fellow, to his credit, does not. And he sets the context very clearly as to what's at stake. And then, ironically to me and unbelievably, he doesn't care. But let me let him speak. He says, he's talking about the concept of human dignity. And the first concept he talks about is behavioral, how we act. You know, we can act in a non-dignified manner. Do you watch the Three Stooges over here in Australia?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Woo, boo, woo, boo, woo, boo, boo. Yeah. Woo, woo, may, mo, woo, woo, woo. I love the Three Stooges. Well, they're not acting in a dignified manner. Pie in the face, right? That's one form of dignity. Then he gets on to what is a different form, which is what is a property or what is intrinsic or inherent in us. And that's where I'm picking up. The second important conception of dignity that we need to consider does not see dignity as a form of behavior, but as a property. Under this conception, the possession of dignity by humans signifies that they have an inherent moral worth. Yes. In other words, because human beings possess dignity, we cannot do what we like to them, exactly, but instead have direct moral obligations toward them. Eureka. One would think that when he has this understanding that he would support human dignity, but as you'll see in a moment, he doesn't. Indeed, this understanding of dignity is also usually considered as serving as the grounding for human rights. You cannot have universal human rights without human dignity. If being human in and of itself is all that matters in terms of our value, then by definition you cannot have universal human rights, because there will be some people who matter and some people who don't, and when you have some people who matter and some people who don't, there's no such thing as universal human rights, because they are no longer universal. They're only universal for those that matter, not for those that don't. And then he says, as Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity. Now you see the stakes involved in the debate over human exceptionalism. It is very essentially human freedom itself and human rights itself. He goes on. The conception of dignity as inherent moral worth certainly seems coherent enough as an idea. Thank you very much. Indeed, we can also see why this conception of dignity is employed in certain debates surrounding bioethics. For if all individual human beings possess dignity, then they should not be viewed simply as resources that we can treat however we please. Yeah. To take an example then, it may be that we could achieve rapid and significant progress in medical science if we were to conduct wide-ranging medical experiments on groups of human beings. However, because human beings have dignity, so it is argued, this means that they possess a particular quality that grounds certain moral obligations and rights. Couldn't have said it better myself. Haven't said it better myself. That's very succinct, very well stated, perfectly and rationally put. If all human beings possess dignity, this extraordinary moral worth, we need some explanation of what it is about the species Homo sapiens that makes them so deserving. And you could go through a whole list of things, ranging from a spiritual issue, but I don't think you have to make the idea of a soul and all that, but in the secular public square, and let's face it, that's what we have. You have it in Australia, we have it in the States. You don't need the idea of a soul to prove human exceptionalism. For example, he points out, look at characteristics such as language use, moral action, sociality, sentience, self-consciousness, and so on. We see that none of these qualities, then he goes, okay, all these issues, then he says, but all of these qualities are not in fact possessed by every human. We are therefore left wondering why all human beings actually do possess dignity. This is the game of what I call the philosopher and the dupe. So you'll say, okay, human beings have unique dignity. Okay, what is it, as the philosopher will say, trying to debunk you? Finally, let's say you get down to, well, we're the only species that is truly creative. I mean, a beaver may build a dam, but that's not a creative act by the beaver. That's an instinctive act by the beaver. Where if we build what in my country, Hoover Dam, and I'm sure you have very big dam projects, that's not the same thing as the beaver building the dam. That's a creative act intended to harness that river for electricity and for a reservoir and so forth. And I understand you now have 90% of your reservoirs are back to full. Thank you, congratulations and all that. I understand there was a crisis. I also understand you have a desalination plant that has rusty pipes before it goes into use. See, I get around. In any event, so let's say we say it's creativity, just to pick one. Then the philosopher says, aha! But not every human being is creative. The newborn infant is not creative because it doesn't yet have that capability. Terry Schiavo had ceased to be creative. Therefore, since those individuals don't have that creativity, you must then treat them as you would treat a non-human. That's the philosopher and the dupe. The response to that is no, 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 no. We do not measure individuals by individuals. Because if you measure individuals by individuals, you by definition are going to create invidious discrimination against those individuals who possess less of that particular quality that you think is what makes humans special. It is inherent in our natures as human beings. It is inherent in every human being to be creative, just to pick that particular one. It is not inherent in any other species to be creative in the known universe. You don't do it by individual, you do it by species. You do it as all of us, because a newborn infant may not be creative, but that newborn infant in its nature is creative. The fetus is not creative at the point, but in its nature. The embryo in its nature is creative. My Uncle Bruno Micheletti ceased to be creative, but it was in his nature as a human being to be creative, and he was only not creative because he got a serious illness. So unless we are immature, disabled, or ill, we all have that particular attribute of creativity. And that is what we must, if we believe in universal human rights, if we believe in freedom and liberty, it must be based on the entire species and not on the individual, because if it's based on the individual, eventually all of us will not have particular capabilities or capacities. I'm jet lagged, excuse me. That means we are not safe, any of us. Because I could walk out on the street, look the wrong way because you drive on the wrong side of the road and get hit by a car and lose those capacities that right now would ground me as having rights. Should I lose my rights if I get hit by a car and become injured? I think not. Should my Uncle Bruno Micheletti have lost his rights as a human being because he became sick? I think not. Should Terry Schiavo have lost her rights as a human being because she had had a heart situation that had deprived her brain of oxygen and left her profoundly disabled? I think not. In fact, I submit that people like Terry Schiavo and my Uncle Bruno Micheletti have a greater call upon us, if anything, not a lesser call, precisely because they cannot take care of themselves. And that is distinctly and uniquely human. And if we lose that, we're in big trouble. But unfortunately, people like Dr. Cochrane don't care. He says, obviously, given controversies over abortion, stem cell research, genetic interventions, animal experimentation, euthanasia, and so on, bioethics does need to engage in debates over which entities possess moral worth and why. But these are best conducted by using the notion of moral status and arguing over the characteristics that warrant possession of it. That's the whole thing I just described with individuals versus all of us. Simply stipulating that all and only human beings possess this inherent moral worth because they have dignity is arbitrary and unhelpful. Yes, it is unhelpful if you want to use people like Terry Schiavo as a source of organs. Yeah, it is unhelpful. Because as he stated earlier, if we have intrinsic dignity, you can't treat a human being that way. If you want to take a fetus and farm it like it's like a farm animal for organs, which is being discussed in bioethics to do human cloning, gestate in artificial vats, wait till they're about 6 months along and take the organs for organ donation, fetal farming it's called. Yeah, it's unhelpful. It's unhelpful because if they're human beings, fetuses which they are, now often as you know in the abortion debates, oh, they're not human. Well, what are they, Martian? What are they, chopped liver? What are they, Vegemite? No. They're nascent human beings. That's biology. What's so ironic, Dr. James, is we argue science, they argue emotional narratives, they're called rational, and we're called dogmatic. It's very bizarre. Hello, media. He says, I urge for an undignified bioethics. He urges for a bioethics that will permit human beings to be used as objects instead of subjects. Because if we go for the undignified bioethics instead of the dignified bioethics, that's exactly where we'll go. And that is exactly what's being advocated in bioethics today. I'm going to do a little bit more of this, because I think it's really important for you to understand that whether you're going to go out and argue about embryonic stem cell research, human cloning research, fetal farming, euthanasia, cutting people's food and fluids off, which I know has been happening now here too, these are the issues, this is the fundamental premises underneath those hot button issues, which, by the way, are often driven by emotional narratives, because as a society, we don't talk in principles anymore. We don't talk about right versus wrong. The media drives us on this emotional frenzy from story to story to story. Part of it, I think, is bias, but part of it is that's how newspapers are sold, or the equivalent thereof. That's why I was really happy to have that interview today, because he took 30 minutes and let us discuss ideas. It's so rare. It was really a delight to just be allowed to have a discussion, a mature adult discussion about first principles from which we should base our actions. Because if everything is about how I feel at the moment, well, right now I feel one way, so that's right, but tomorrow if I change my mind, suddenly that other thing becomes right. And you end up with emotional chaos and societal chaos. That's no way to run a railroad. In any event, here's some more on this issue of bioethics and intrinsic dignity. Peter Singer, who, as you all know, comes from here, down in Monash University, and he believes that it isn't being human that gives value, it's being a person. And he describes, and this, by the way, is a position that is rife throughout bioethics. You also have another Aussie named Julian Savulescu, who has the same kind of attitudes and gets the same kind of attention as Peter Singer. He gets to go to Cambridge, I think, or Oxford. Oxford? He gets to go to Oxford, even better. So, you know, if you advocate infanticide like Peter Singer, you go to Princeton. And if you're like Julian Savulescu, who's, to me, anything goes, you get to go to Oxford. I get to have a home office. I'm not jealous, no. Anyway, this is an article written in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal. That's important because the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal is one of the top 10 bioethics journals in the world. It's on the Georgetown University campus, ostensibly Catholic. Yeah, it's not, by which I mean it's not somebody in a corner wearing a pyramid on the internet. That would be me. But it's really big-time, mainstream bioethics, very respectable publication. So if it's in this publication, it's not fringe, it's mainstream. And he says, many, if not most, of the problems of healthcare ethics presuppose that we have a view about what sorts of beings have something that we might think of as ultimate moral value. Or if this sounds too apocalyptic, then we certainly need to identify those sorts of individuals who have the highest moral value or importance, or moral value or importance comparable to that to which we believe ourselves entitled. This theory. Peter Singer says a person is an individual, be it an animal or a human, that can value its own life over time. Harris says a person is an animal or a human being who can value his or her own life. This kind of thing. And so in this view, there is such a thing as the human non-person. where a human non-person has a lower value than a person, because in this view, some animals are persons. And in fact, the value of life depends on the quality of your mental capacities, person versus non-person. They don't state this, but I don't see why it wouldn't be true. Well, if it's true that you can say that a human being is a person because he has certain cognitive capacities, and a different human being is not a person because they don't have these capacities, then why not have distinctions within the personhood theory, the personhood category, so that the person with the highest IQ is more of a person than the person with the middle IQ, or even more of a person than a person who's with a lower IQ. I mean, once you start invidiously discriminating against ourselves, there's no way you're going to limit it. And so there is such a thing in this view, and again, it's widespread within bioethics, that there's such a thing as a human non-person. And in fact, in bioethics as well as in animal rights, to say that human beings have higher value than an animal simply because we're human is speciesism. This is a term that was popularized by Peter Singer, not coined by him, but popularized, that says if one is a speciesist, that's as bad as being a racist. And my response to that is speciesism is misanthropic and anti-human. Because if I decide that I have greater value than, say, an Aborigine based on race, I am engaging in invidious discrimination because I am taking an equal and trying to make that person an unequal. That is wrong. If I say I have greater value than a kangaroo, I am telling the truth because I do have greater value than a kangaroo. So how is speciesism equating with racism? It isn't, if you believe in universal human equality. Speciesism, by definition, denies universal human equality because it says that that animals have as much right to consideration as people. And also the concept of animal rights. If a squirrel has rights, you have squirrels? You don't have squirrels?
Possums.
Possums. Well, we have possums too. But okay, if a possum, you don't have squirrels. That's right, all your mammals are marsupials, right? The indigenous?
We have rats.
You got rats. All right, there we have something in common. If a rat is considered to have rights and I'm considered to have rights, what does that do to the concept of rights? It waters it down in the same way wild inflation destroys currency, because we intrinsically, inherently, instinctively know that the rat and I, or the rat and you and any of you, are not the same and don't have the same moral worth. We can't. And if we start going by the fiction that we do, what gets destroyed is the importance and robustness of the concept and the principle of rights. Anyway, back to Harris. You know, short-winded isn't my strong suit. You know, personhood provides a species-neutral way, that's that speciesism issue, of grouping creatures that have lives that would be wrong to end by killing or by letting die. These may include animals, machines, extraterrestrials, gods, angels, and devils. The idea being, if we're going to measure everything by the same standards, this cup of water, the rat we have in our countries, and us. So the rat has greater value than the water, which I think all of us would agree with because the water isn't a living thing. It's inanimate, the glass is inanimate. The rat has value, I mean, in the sense that we have a human obligation not to treat it inhumanely. Of course, the rat doesn't have any obligations toward us. It can steal our food, it can bite our babies. It's just being a rat. It's not acting immorally because rats are amoral. They're just doing what rats do. And then there's people. Now, in this idea, if, let's say, the monkey, which is often used, had higher capacities than a disabled human, say my Uncle Bruno Micheletti, toward the end of his Alzheimer's, then the monkey has higher value than my Uncle Bruno Micheletti. Peter Singer calls that the quality of life ethic, and that's what Harris is talking about here. And this is where it leads. Persons who want to live are wrong by being killed because they are thereby deprived of something they value. In other words, it's relativistic as well. Killing isn't wrong because it's wrong. It's only wrong if the person killed valued his or her life. So he goes on to say, persons who do not want to live are not on this account harmed by having the wish to die granted through voluntary euthanasia, for example. I could spend 1 hour rebutting that sentence, and that illustrates the problem we have today. These assertions are taken at face value, and it takes us a long time to explain why they're full of beans. Do you use that expression, full of beans? Baloney. Baloney. What other? Is there an expression that's just garbage that you guys use? That'll do. Just garbage. Okay. Then he goes on, non-persons or potential persons cannot be wronged in this way because death does not deprive them of anything they can value. If they cannot wish to live, they cannot have that wish frustrated by being killed. Think about that. If my Uncle Bruno cannot value his life because he's so demented, he's in a mental limbo, then killing him is not wrong. Because in essence, what we're saying is he's not a human being any longer. In other words, personhood theory tells us who we can kill and get a good night's sleep. Very dangerous stuff, particularly when you get to the idea, as we all have, and I've been reading some of the stories in the Australian press, certainly in my country, the issue of medical resources. And if we can declare the most expensive patients for which to care non-persons, we could save a lot of money. And once you get over that hump, because they are human, but once you can define them out of it, then it becomes a lot easier to eradicate them, doesn't it? And there are an awful lot of people in all of our countries that could be targeted if we ever, as a society, and we haven't yet, accepted that idea of the human non-person. In fact, the way we win this fight is bring them out of the ivory tower and force them to fight over human exceptionalism. That's the battlefield we can win. Because the people of our countries are not going to stand for their relatives being dehumanized. But they don't know it's happening. And so one of the things that we need to do in the States and here in Australia is we have to get these ideas out and expose them, not just as musings by people off in the ivory tower. These people influence policy. And this is what they're urging for now. And you know what they urged for in the past, and it came to pass. But we can win this fight in the public square. And in my country, what we say, we can win it on Main Street. And that's what we have to do. We have to expose these ideas as the pernicious evils that they are in ways that average people can understand. People who just want to go home and watch rugby and have a beer. We have to let them see what is coming because it's a threat to them, their parents, their siblings, and their disabled children. It even gets worse. Tom Beauchamp, B-E-A-U-C-H-A-M-P, writing in the same Kennedy Institute Ethics Journal, if you want to look it up, by the way, December 1999. He's important because he co-authored the principal textbook in bioethics, certainly used in my country, and I wouldn't be surprised here, called The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And he wrote this: because many human beings lack properties of personhood or are less than full persons, they are thereby rendered equal or inferior in moral standing to some non-humans. If this conclusion is defensible, we will need to rethink our traditional view that these unlucky humans cannot be treated in ways that we treat relevantly similar non-humans. For example, they might be aggressively used as human research subjects and sources of organs. So now we see that when you give up human exceptionalism, go for an undignified bioethics, accept personhood theory, not only are some human beings kicked out of the right to life, but become mere natural resources, corn crops ripe for the harvest. And believe me, that's on the drawing board. This is from The Lancet. Should organs from patients in persistent permanent vegetative state be used for transplantation? Quote, if the legal definition of death were to be changed to include the comprehensive irreversible loss, I'm sorry I'm slurring my words, it's my jet lag, irreversible loss of higher brain function, it would be possible to take the life of a patient or more accurately stop the heart, since the patient would be defined as dead. So now death isn't even biological, it's sociological. And then take the organ subject to the usual criteria for consent. Two Harvard doctors, we propose that, this is in critical care medicine, we propose that individuals who desire to donate their organs and are either neurologically devastated or imminently dying should be allowed to donate their organs without first being declared dead. It goes on and on and on. I've got a whole file full. This is not happening now in the hospitals. But there are a lot of very powerful people who want it to happen because they want to dehumanize the most weak and vulnerable among us and harvest them and profit off them. In fact, the new area of tremendous potential profit is the human body itself. And we see biological colonialism, as I call it. People in the rich West going to China and buying organs, buying a liver for $100,000, knowing that that came from a prisoner who was murdered or executed for that liver because there was a genetic compatibility. Pakistan recently had to pass a law saying there could be no organ transplants of donated organs from living persons like a kidney unless there was a close relationship. Why? Because Westerners were coming in and buying kidneys from destitute people and leaving them sick and suffering because they were looked at as a mere copper mine. Women in India are being paid by women in the UK to gestate their babies. And what if the baby isn't what the paying family wants? It ends up in an orphanage. This is what happens when we lose the concept of human exceptionalism. And of course, some of this is as old as history. My country had slavery. It is no different, though, than that. It's just a different form. Are we ready for a market in feed? And there's no equality of bargaining in terms of, well, it's a contract. You're dealing with desperate, destitute people. This is a bioethicist named Jacob Appel, writing in the Huffington Post. That's important because the Huffington Post is the most notable left-wing on-site blog and website in America. About 1 million hits a day. And he argued that women who want to abort should be paid to, you were talking about 12 weeks or under, you were talking about 12 weeks or under in the poll. He would pay women to abort to say 5-6 months, pay to gestate further along in their pregnancy so that when the fetus was aborted, the organs and tissues could be used. He argued that women should be paid to gestate so that and then abort so that the organs and tissues should be used. And he argued that, he says, someday if we are fortunate, scientific research may make possible farms of artificial wombs breeding fetuses for their organs. This is in a very influential and popular website in the States. We're running out of time, so I'll move forward. Now you see why I'm so much fun at parties. Is there a duty to die? Guess what the answer is. This is from John Hardwick, Is There a Duty to Die? Hastings Center Report. The Hastings Center Report is the most influential bioethics journal in the world. I think that's safe to say. And here's what he says. A duty to die is more likely when continuing to live will impose significant burdens. That's another form of suffering, isn't it? Emotional burdens, extensive caregiving, destruction of life plans, and yes, financial hardship on your family and loved ones. This is the fundamental insight underlying a duty to die. A duty to die becomes greater as you grow older. To have reached the age of, say, 75 or 80 years without being ready to die is itself a moral failing, the sign of a life out of touch with life's basic realities. My mother is going to be 93 in 2 weeks. I'm an only child. She sold her house in Los Angeles. It was paid off. Cha-ching. If I went to Mom and said, hey, Mom, you have a duty to die, I'd have the duty to die. Remember the white tornado? Did you have that commercial? My mother's 4'8". She would kick me from here to Monday if I told her she had a duty to die. I mean, think about it. This is where we go, and I'm going to close now, when you give up the concept of equal human worth, human exceptionalism, the sanctity of human life, and everything you were all fighting for. Thank you very much. I can take questions if you want, or are we too late?
No, I think we've got time to take some questions. So if anyone would like to ask any questions, then please indicate, and I'm sure answer.
Wesley, do you really think this tide of opinion can change without the cultural renewal underneath it? That has turned around slavery, turned around the Roman Empire's treatments. Is it not that at present we have certain assumptions of how we treat each other because we still have the old habits of Christian worldview where we have value only because we matter to God? If that theory is correct, of course we have value and we treat each other.
Right, right.
But if that theory's gone, in a way, aren't they really being quite reasonable and logical with their tidy-minded way?
Right. For the tape, the question is, can this wave, if you will, or this current, societal current, be turned around without, let's call it a religious renewal, that would return society to the concept of God as being in control and so forth? Maybe. I think it can, and I've been really focusing, as you heard tonight, and in fact since I began my work, not making religious arguments. And I think you have to do that in the public square today. These are secular societies, at least in terms of our public policy and our debates, whether one likes it or doesn't like it. So if one says, well, only God can take a life as a reason to oppose assisted suicide, and the person you're speaking to says, well, I don't believe in God, that ends the conversation, unless you've got something else to describe. I really searched for something in a secular society as I was beginning this work. How can we reach people in a secular society with secular values in a way that they will see the importance? And I came up with what I think is still true. And I do think it is because of our past and the history of Judeo-Christianity, at least as a moral philosophy, if not a faith. It's very ironic that that aspect which brought us freedom and equality, which is Judeo-Christianity. Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, was a deist. He was certainly not a born-again Christian, but he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That has been the most powerful, I think, secular sentence written in the last 250 years, to the point that it even affects the most tyrannical societies today, who at least give lip service to the idea of human freedom. So it struck me, and I still believe, and even Richard Dawkins, arguing for atheism, also argues for Judeo-Christian moral philosophy in terms of values. Not completely, but to some degree anyway. But it struck me that the lingua franca of the West is universal human rights. We have had such an emphasis on it. You had the UN Declaration of Human Rights I mentioned. If we argue from that aspect, I think we can prevail in this society even if there's not a renewal, because I do believe people are invested in human equality. You know, they fought very hard to end racism and sexism and all of this, and they're very invested in it. To now turn around and say, well, it really isn't true, that that human equality isn't true. One of the things I like to do, for example, let's take Harris, when he wrote this sentence I read to you: persons who want to live are wronged by being killed because, that's not the one, sorry, this one. Many, if not most, of the problems of healthcare ethics presuppose that we have a view about what sorts of beings have something that we might think of as the ultimate moral value. Or if this sounds too apocalyptic, then we certainly need to identify those sorts of individuals who have the highest moral value or importance. Now, what I will often say is, now substitute the word race for individual. We have to, hold on, or if this sounds too apocalyptic, then we certainly need to identify those sorts of, those races who have the highest moral value or importance. Immediately, you can see that's bigotry. So what we're talking about here is the same kind of bigotry, just different victims. And victims who have less capacity to defend themselves than the racial victims of the past. So I do think, and a renewal of our cultures is much to be yearned for, prayed for. not just on these issues, but many other issues. Look at the suffering that is caused by the rejection of Judeo-Christian moral values. Tremendous suffering out there. But on these issues, and I also urge that you not get into other issues like sexual ethics and so forth. And you're going to deal with life issues, then stick with life issues, because you want people who might disagree with you about sexual values to agree with you about life values. If you want to persuade people, you can't push people out, at least in a pro-life sense. That's a different situation than being in a, say, a family values organization. But I would suggest that if you're in a, quote, pro-life organization, you stick with the sanctity of human life and try to bring in as many people as you can and not push people away. But I do think that human rights has that opportunity, and it at least helps us hold our fingers in the dikes until perhaps the cavalry can come to the rescue. And that's all I'm trying to do right now. And I think that at this point, at this moment, we're at Dunkirk. But remember, after Dunkirk came D-Day and VE Day.
Yeah, and Dunkirk and VE Day were against Nazism.
Ah.
And what we're forgetting is that all the stuff they're talking about now has very, very strong overtones of Nazi ideology.
And that's something that the question was, or the comment, not a question, an assertion which is true, is that many of the things we're talking about now have, she said the victory at VE Day and the whole issue of Dunkirk was a fight with the Nazis, that these issues we're talking about now have very strong associations with what happened during that era. And that's absolutely right. But I urge you, you don't go out and say, this is the Nazis, because people who might be tempted by these issues don't think of themselves as Nazis, and in fact are not Nazis. It'll bounce off their foreheads, and they'll reject you. But if you bring out these issues like they're killing babies in the Netherlands, somebody might say, well, didn't they do that in Germany? Weren't doctors hanged after Nuremberg because of killing disabled babies? Then you can say, you're right. They were. That's true. And then you haven't called them Nazis. They've said, oh my gosh, this is like the Nazis. You let them come to that revelation. Of course, that assumes that history is still being taught in the schools, and I don't know whether that's true. One more question? Sir.
It seems to me that Australia we lack resources, we lack strategies, and we lack people with confidence to be able to go to the marketplace.
We lack confidence to be...
We lack people who have the confidence or the assertiveness to go into the market.
I see, yeah. I lack advocates who can go out...
Or even to raise the
yeah.
debate that you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that a similar issue in the States?
No, we're pretty assertive, and we have advocates who go out into the marketplace, sometimes in an obnoxious fashion. I would say in America, the problem with some pro-lifers is they can be obnoxious. And when you're trying to communicate, you have to come from where the audience is, not where you are. You have to understand where they are and not change your message. I believe in the same message, but you have to say it in a way that will invite people in and not push people out. I think that that's one of the reasons I'm brought here, is because I think you all, and you can answer this better than I can, Dr. James, but I think you need to get into a concerted training program to have those advocates. I know in my country there people are trained to take these positions, and yes, we do have a resource problem in my country too for the pro-life movement or for allies of the pro-life movement. I consider myself an ally of the pro-life movement. We do have resource issues. But what we lack in money, we more than make up for in energy, and we more than make up for in the righteousness of our message. Abraham Lincoln said, right makes might. And I think that that's absolutely true. And so if you all find people who are willing to be, that was for you, by the way. If you are willing to give themselves to this issue, and if they can get the support, organized support to get trained in how to go out, be on television, talk to the media, look in the eye, not worry if people think they're idiots and so forth. If you're going to be an activist, the first thing you have to do is be willing not to be liked. So if you find somebody who has a relatively young, I think, younger than me, surely, with a good assertive personality, and you can train them. In the States, the pro-lifers are actually, they hold, for example, oratory contests for young people. They are looking for those young people to come and take the place of the gray hairs. And when I started doing the anti-euthanasia stuff, and that was when I first started being invited to pro-life events, I noticed an awful lot of gray hair. And today now, and it's not hair dye, I'm seeing a lot of, yeah, me too, a lot of dark hair and a lot of young and youth. So I do think it can happen. And I'll turn it over to Dr. about that a little more. Thank you.